A mountain man paid $1 for an infertile bride, but what he did next shocked everyone. In a snow-buried town where whispers cut deeper than the wind, a silent trapper steps forward with a single silver coin, buying the woman no one else would claim. Folks laugh, calling it a mockery of marriage. But up in the mountains, that dollar begins a story no soul could have foretold. As the storm rages, faith flickers in a lonely cabin, where mercy dares to bloom on barren ground. Yet when a half-starved boy appears at their door and the law rides in to tear them apart, one act of compassion becomes a battle between heaven and man's decree. A preacher's pride, a sheriff's order, and a barren woman's prayer collide in a showdown that could break or bless the whole town. What happens when love plants roots where life was thought impossible? And how far will one mountain man go to prove that even a broken heart can bear a miracle? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The winter wind howled through the cracks of White Rock's community hall, making the oil lamps flicker and dance against rough-hewn walls. Aurora Bell Cutter pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, fighting back the shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. The annual widows' auction always drew a crowd, but this year felt different, darker, more cruel. Elias Hart's voice cut through the murmur of the gathered townsfolk. Well now, who'll start the bidding for Widow Cutter's upkeep? His lips curled into what might have passed for a smile, if not for the malice in his eyes. Though I reckon there ain't much point in calling her a widow, when she couldn't even give poor James children before the fever took him. The words stung like winter frost. Aurora lifted her chin, willing herself to stand straight despite the weight of stairs pressing down on her shoulders. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she shifted, trying to find strength in the familiar hymns she'd learned as a girl. But even those seemed to mock her now. Whispers slithered through the crowd like serpents. "Barren," they said. "A curse. What use is she to any man?" Someone coughed, a sound too close to laughter, and others joined in, no longer bothering to hide their derision. Aurora fixed her gaze on the far wall, where a cross hung crooked in the lamplight. She'd spent countless Sundays in this very hall, cooking for church socials, tending to sick children, sharing what little she had. Now those same neighbors wouldn't meet her eyes. "Come now," Elias continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Surely someone needs a cook, a washerwoman?" He paused for effect. "Though I suppose there's little point in hoping she might give you sons to help with the work." Real laughter erupted then, sharp and cruel as the wind outside. Aurora's hands trembled, but she kept them clasped tight before her, knuckles white with the effort of maintaining dignity. The silence that followed was worse than the laughter. It stretched out, heavy with judgment, until Aurora could barely breathe through the thickness of it. She closed her eyes, praying for strength, for deliverance, for... Thud. The sound was soft, but somehow cut through everything else. Aurora's eyes flew open to find a single silver dollar lying on the auction table, its surface catching the lamplight like a star fallen to earth. Henry Cutter stood beside it, his massive frame casting long shadows across the floor. Snow still clung to his buckskin coat, and his dark beard was flecked with ice. He must have just come down from the high country. Aurora hadn't even seen him enter. The crowd drew back slightly. Henry had that effect on people, not from any meanness in him, but from the sheer presence of him. He was like one of his beloved mountains made flesh, tall, quiet, immovable. Pastor Ezekiel Rhodes cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with this unexpected turn. "Mr. Cutter," he said, his usual commanding tone wavering slightly. "This is unusual. You've never participated in the widow's auction before." "No, sir." Henry's voice was low and steady, like distant thunder. "Never saw the need." "And now?" the pastor pressed. "What need brings you here today?" Henry's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, fixed on Elias Hart for a moment before turning to Aurora. There was something in that look. Not pity, which she couldn't have borne, but understanding. Maybe even respect. "A woman's worth ain't measured by her womb," he said simply. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of discomfort through the crowd. Elias stepped forward, his face flushed. "Now see here, Cutter." But Henry was already moving, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he picked up the quill and signed his name to the contract. His writing was rough but clear, each letter carved into the paper with deliberate care. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Aurora and offering his arm. "If you're willing?" Aurora looked at that offered arm, strong enough to break a man, yet held out to her with such careful courtesy. She thought of her little cabin on the edge of town, of the whispers and stares, of the lonely nights wondering if God had truly abandoned her. She took his arm. The crowd parted like water as Henry led her out. She could feel Elias Hart's glare burning into her back, could hear the shocked murmurs rising behind them, but Henry's solid presence beside her made it all seem distant, unimportant. Outside, the snow was falling harder, big flakes catching in Aurora's hair and on her shawl. Henry's wagon waited by the hitching post, the horses stamping restlessly in the cold. Without a word, he helped her up onto the seat, tucking a heavy buffalo robe around her before climbing up himself. The wagon creaked as they started moving, its wheels cutting, fresh tracks in the new fallen snow. Aurora sat rigid, uncertain, her mind whirling with questions she didn't know how to ask. The lantern swaying from the wagon's frame cast shifting shadows across the trail ahead, making the familiar path to the high country seem strange and new. Henry didn't speak. His hands were steady on the reins, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But there was nothing threatening in his silence. It felt more like he was giving her space to find her footing in this sudden change of circumstances. The snow muffled all sound except the horses' hooves and the wagon's wheels. Aurora watched her breath cloud in the cold air, thinking of all the ways life could turn in an instant. This morning, she'd been Aurora Bell, the barren widow, object of pity and scorn. Now she was... What? She glanced at the man beside her, this near stranger who had just bought her contract with a single silver dollar and a handful of words that had cut through years of shame like a knife through butter. The wagon hit a rut, jostling them both. Henry's arm shot out instinctively to steady her, then withdrew just as quickly. "Sorry," he muttered, the first word he'd spoken since leaving town. "No need," Aurora replied softly. Then, because the silence felt too heavy with things unsaid, she added, "Thank you. For what you did back there." Henry nodded once, his profile sharp against the darkening sky. "Weren't right what they were doing. What they were saying." He paused, then continued in that same measured way. "Man ought to judge himself before judging others." Aurora turned those words over in her mind, hearing the echo of scripture in them. She'd thought Henry Cutter was godless, like many of the mountain men who came down to trade. But maybe, like so much else about this day, she'd been wrong about that too. The snow was falling thicker now, the wind picking up as they climbed higher into the foothills. The lantern light flickered over the trail, turning the snowflakes into falling stars. Aurora huddled deeper into the buffalo robe, stolen glances at her unexpected protector that she hoped he wouldn't notice. What sort of man was he, really? She'd seen him in town maybe a dozen times over the years, trading furs or buying supplies. He kept to himself, spoke little, never caused trouble. But she'd also heard stories, how he'd once been an army scout, how he'd had a wife and child who died in a blizzard, how he now lived alone in a cabin so high in the mountains that even the Indians rarely ventured there. The wagon crested a rise, and suddenly the lights of White Rock were visible below, small and distant as fallen embers. Aurora looked back at them, feeling the strange vertigo of watching her old life recede into the darkness. When she turned forward again, she found Henry watching her, his expression unreadable in the lantern's shifting light. "We can turn back," he said quietly, "if you've changed your mind." The offer surprised her, not just the words themselves, but the gentle way he said them, like her choice really mattered to him. She thought about going back down to those lights, to the whispers and the stares, and Elias Hart's cruel smile. "No," she said, and was surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "No, I don't want to turn back." Henry nodded once, as if he'd expected no other answer, and clucked to the horses. The wagon moved forward into the gathering night, carrying them both toward whatever lay ahead in the high country. The silence between them was different now, still awkward, but somehow softer, more companionable. The snow continued to fall, and the lantern light flickered over the trail, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its mate. Aurora found herself thinking of another winter night, years ago, when she'd first learned she would never bear children. She'd thought then that her life was over, that she would never know joy again. But here she was, heading into the unknown with a stranger who had defended her worth with a single silver dollar and a truth she'd almost forgotten, that God's measure of a person went deeper than the shallow judgments of men. The wagon creaked onward through the snow, carrying its two lonely souls up into the mountains, where the stars burned bright and clear above the storm clouds, like promises waiting to be kept. Dawn broke pale and thin over the mountain trail, painting the snow-covered ground in shades of pearl and silver. Aurora Bell sat rigid on the wagon bench, her gloved hands clutching the rough wood as the mule team strained against their harnesses. Beside her, Henry Cutter guided the animals with quiet confidence, his broad shoulders hunched against the biting wind that moaned through the fir branches overhead. The frozen ruts in the trail made the wagon creak and shudder. Each jolt sent a shiver through Aurora's already tense frame. She stole glances at her silent companion, trying to read something, anything, in that weathered profile. The events of yesterday still felt like a dream. The humiliation of the auction, the cruel whispers, and then Henry's unexpected intervention with that single silver dollar. The town of White Rock had disappeared behind them hours ago, swallowed by the rolling foothills and stands of evergreens. Aurora watched the last familiar landmarks fade away, feeling both relief and apprehension twist in her stomach. The wind carried the sharp scent of pine and wood smoke, so different from the coal dust and horse manure that always hung over town. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing mile. Aurora's thoughts churned like creek water over stones. What kind of man was he, really? What had possessed him to buy her contract? The questions pressed against her lips until she couldn't contain them any longer. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally, her voice barely carrying over the crunch of hooves and the whisper of wind. Henry's hands tightened, slightly on the reins. "Maybe not," he replied, his voice as rough as creek gravel. "But I did." The simple words held no explanation, no justification. Just fact, as plain as the mountains rising before them. Aurora pulled her shawl tighter, unsure whether the chill she felt came from the wind or from the weight of all the things left unsaid between them. They continued climbing, the trail growing steeper and narrower. The mules' breath steamed in the cold air as they picked their way carefully around sharp turns and over icy patches. Henry handled them with steady hands and quiet words of encouragement, showing none of the impatience she'd seen other men display with their animals. Near midday, they came to a creek partially frozen over, its waters black and quick between sheets of ice. Henry drew the wagon to a halt, the brake grinding against the wheel. "Need to water the mules," he said, jumping down from the bench. He turned and held up his hands to help her down, but didn't press when she managed on her own, her boots crunching in the crusty snow. Aurora watched as Henry led the mules to a break in the ice, where the water ran clear. His movements were gentle, almost tender, as he guided each animal to drink. "Easy there, girl," she heard him murmur to the lead mule when it shied at a floating piece of ice. "Ain't nothing to fear." The sound of his voice, so soft and careful with the animals, made something twist in Aurora's chest. She'd expected roughness from a mountain man, the kind of callousness that came from years of solitude. Instead, she saw hands that knew how to be gentle despite their strength, eyes that watched for signs of distress or discomfort in his charges. While the mules drank, Aurora stamped her feet to keep warm, taking in their surroundings. The creek cut through a narrow valley, its banks lined with bare willows and ice-covered rocks. Above them, the mountains proper began their real climb toward the sky, stark and beautiful, and utterly foreign to someone who'd spent most of her life in town. "It's different up here," she said, more to herself than to Henry. He glanced at her as he checked the mules' harnesses. "Aye, cleaner, quieter." He paused, running a hand along one mule's flank. "Harder too, in its way, but honest about it." They ate a cold lunch of cornbread and jerky before continuing on. The trail wound higher into increasingly rugged country, following game paths and old mining tracks that Aurora would have missed if she hadn't been watching Henry's shore navigation. The afternoon light grew thin and gray, warning of the early winter dusk to come. Just as the shadows were beginning to lengthen into evening, Henry guided the wagon off the trail toward a dark shape tucked against a hillside, an abandoned miner's cabin, its log walls still mostly sound despite the sagging roof. "We'll stop here," Henry announced, bringing the mules to a halt. "Too dangerous to travel these trails after dark." He helped Aurora down from the wagon, then set about caring for the mules with methodical attention. Aurora stood uncertain for a moment before gathering fallen branches for a fire. The work gave her hands something to do, even if she felt Henry's eyes on her from time to time, watching, assessing. The cabin's interior was simple. One room, a stone fireplace, a few broken pieces of furniture left behind when the mine played out. Henry soon had a fire crackling in the hearth, its warmth beating back the chill that had settled into Aurora's bones during the day's journey. They shared a simple supper of beans, warmed in a tin pot over the flames. Aurora couldn't help studying Henry's hands as he ate. Large hands, scarred from years of trapping and mountain life. But there was something else there too, a sort of careful precision in the way he held his spoon, like a man who remembered gentler days. The firelight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, carved deeper shadows in the lines around his eyes. Those eyes held sorrow, she realized, the kind that came from losing something precious. The stories she'd heard in town about his dead wife and child came back to her, and she wondered if that shared experience of loss was part of what had prompted him to help her. As the fire burned lower, Aurora spread her bedroll near the hearth, keeping a proper distance from where Henry had laid his own. Before lying down, she knelt and clasped her hands, closing her eyes in prayer. "Lord," she whispered, "grant me courage for whatever lies ahead. And—" She hesitated, then added softly, "Watch over us both in these mountains." She felt Henry's eyes on her but didn't turn to meet his gaze. When she finished and settled into her blankets, she saw him still sitting by the fire, his face unreadable in the dancing light. He sat there long after she closed her eyes, saying nothing, the silence broken only by the pop and hiss of burning wood. Sleep was slow in coming. Aurora lay awake, listening to the wind's mournful song through the fir branches outside, feeling the vast wildness of the mountains pressing in around their small island of warmth and light. So much had changed in just one day. Yesterday morning, she'd been Aurora Bell, the barren widow, facing public shame at a charity auction. Now she was, what? Wife? Servant? Partner? The contract wasn't specific about such things. She turned carefully beneath her blankets, studying Henry's profile through half-closed eyes. He hadn't moved, still staring into the flames, as if they held answers to questions he couldn't voice. The firelight caught the edges of old scars on his hands, marks of a life lived hard and alone in these mountains. Yet those same hands had shown such gentleness with the mules, such care in every task. What kind of man was he really? The question followed Aurora into her uneasy dreams, where she walked through endless snow while the wind whispered secrets she couldn't quite hear. The fire burned lower, casting long shadows on the cabin's rough walls. Outside, an owl called once, its voice echoing off the mountainsides. Henry remained motionless, keeping his silent vigil as Aurora slept, his eyes reflecting both the dying flames and some deeper, more personal fire that seemed to burn within him, a mixture of memory and pain that the night's darkness couldn't quite hide. The pale winter sun had barely cleared the mountain peaks when Aurora woke to the sound of Henry readying the mules. Frost glittered on the cabin's small window, and her breath misted in the cold morning air. They shared a quick breakfast of coffee and the last of the cornbread before setting out on what Henry promised would be the final leg of their journey. The trail grew steeper as they climbed, winding through stands of snow-laden pines. The mules' hooves broke through crusty snow with each step, and the wagon wheels creaked against the frozen ground. Aurora pulled her shawl tighter, watching as Henry guided them higher into the wilderness with the same quiet confidence he'd shown yesterday. Near mid-morning, they crested a ridge, and Henry drew the wagon to a halt. "There," he said, gesturing ahead with his chin. "Home." Aurora leaned forward, following his gaze. The valley below opened up like a painting, pristine snow stretching toward distant peaks, broken only by a cluster of dark pines. Nestled among the trees stood a sturdy log cabin, smoke rising straight and steady from its stone chimney into the crystal-clear mountain air. "Someone's there?" Aurora asked, puzzled by the smoke. "Marshal Cooper," Henry explained, clicking to the mules to start moving again. "Checks on things when I'm gone. Keeps the fire going if he knows I'm heading back." As they drew closer, the cabin's details emerged. It was larger than the mining shelter they'd slept in, built to withstand the mountain winters with thick logs and a roof pitched steep to shed snow. A stack of split wood reached halfway up one wall, and Aurora spotted a small barn or storage shed off to one side. What struck her most was the isolation. No other buildings broke the endless white of the snow-covered valley. No paths led away except the one they'd followed. No smoke rose from any other chimney for as far as she could see. "Nearest neighbor's 5 miles that way," Henry said, as if reading her thoughts. He pointed toward the west. Trading posts a day's ride south, weather permitting. The wagon crunched to a stop before the cabin's front door. Henry helped Aurora down, then immediately went to tend to the mules. She stood for a moment, taking in what was to be her new home. The cabin looked solid and well-maintained, if plain. A small covered porch protected the front door, and she could see shutters on the windows, currently pulled open to let in the winter light. Marshal Cooper met them at the door, a weathered man with gray hair and kind eyes. He tipped his hat to Aurora. "Ma'am, got the fire?" "Going good for you both. Henry's a fine man, despite his gruff ways." He shared a meaningful look with Henry before mounting his horse and heading down the trail they'd just climbed. Inside, the cabin was clean but sparse. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames crackling warmly. 2 wooden chairs faced the hearth. A single bed stood in one corner, covered with a faded quilt that had once been blue and white, but had softened to gentler shades with age. A rough-hewn table with 4 chairs occupied the center of the room. Basic cooking implements hung from hooks, and she spotted a door that likely led to a root cellar. What caught Aurora's eye, however, was the wooden cross mounted above the fireplace. It wasn't store-bought, but carefully carved by hand, the wood smooth and dark with age. Something about it drew her closer, and as she approached, she noticed other details: a pair of tin cups on the mantel, a small wooden horse that looked like a child's toy, a faded daguerreotype in a simple frame. Movement beyond the window pulled her attention away. Through the glass, she spotted 2 small crosses rising from the snow maybe 50 paces from the cabin. Her heart tightened with understanding. Grabbing her shawl, she stepped outside and made her way carefully through the snow. The crosses were weathered but well-tended, the area around them cleared of brush. Kneeling in the snow, Aurora read the careful carving on the first cross: Mary Cutter, beloved wife and mother. The second, smaller cross bore a single line: Samuel Cutter, age 4 years. The dates showed they'd died on the same day, 7 years ago. Aurora bowed her head, understanding now the shadow she'd seen in Henry's eyes, the careful way he held himself apart. A wife and son, lost together. The isolation of his chosen home took on new meaning, not just physical distance, but an attempt to retreat from the pain of loss. When she stood and turned back toward the cabin, Henry was standing in the doorway. His face was impossible to read, but his eyes were clouded with old grief. "They're gone," he said simply, his voice rough. Aurora looked at him for a long moment, seeing the years of loneliness etched in the lines of his face. "Then maybe God sent me so you wouldn't be," she said softly. Something flickered across Henry's features: surprise, uncertainty, perhaps a trace of hope quickly hidden. He looked at her as if seeing her properly for the first time, then turned and went back inside without speaking. Aurora remained by the graves a moment longer, offering a silent prayer for the souls of Mary and Samuel Cutter, and for the man who carried their loss so heavily. When she finally returned to the cabin, she found Henry had brought in their supplies and was storing them in the root cellar. The afternoon passed in a quiet rhythm of small tasks. Aurora familiarized herself with the kitchen area, noting what they had and what they might need. She found good stores of dried meat, beans, and flour, along with preserved vegetables in the cool cellar. Henry worked outside, caring for the mules and checking his trap lines near the cabin. As evening approached, Aurora set about making a stew with dried beef and some of the vegetables she'd found. The familiar work helped settle her mind, giving her hands something useful to do while she processed everything she'd learned about her new husband. The cabin slowly filled with the rich smell of cooking food. Aurora lit the oil lamp as the early winter darkness crept in, its warm glow softening the cabin's stark interior. Henry came in from his work, stamping snow from his boots. He hung his coat by the door and settled into one of the chairs by the fire, watching as she moved about the kitchen area. Through the window, fresh snow had begun to fall, thick flakes drifting past the lamplight. The cabin felt a touch warmer than when they'd arrived, and not just from the fire. Small signs of life had already begun to appear. Aurora's shawl draped over the back of a chair, the smell of cooking food, 2 cups set out for evening tea instead of one. As Aurora stirred the stew one final time, she glanced at Henry's silent figure by the fire. His eyes were fixed on the flames, but she suspected he was seeing something else entirely. Perhaps memories of another woman moving through this kitchen, another time when the cabin had been full of family and life. Yet he'd chosen to bring her here, to share this space that held so much of his past. The snow continued to fall outside, adding another layer of white to the already buried valley. Inside, the stew bubbled gently on the stove. The lamp cast its steady light, and 2 people who had been alone yesterday began the careful work of learning to share a home. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight glinting off the fresh snow. Aurora woke early, her breath visible in the cold air of the cabin. She had slept on the quilt-covered bed while Henry had insisted on taking the floor near the fireplace. The embers still glowed faintly, and she could see his large form wrapped in blankets, chest rising and falling steadily. She moved quietly, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil. The familiar routine helped calm her racing thoughts. This was her first full day as Henry's wife, though the word felt strange, considering the circumstances that had brought them together. As she worked, her eyes kept returning to the wooden cross above the fireplace. The marriage certificate they'd signed at the auction felt incomplete somehow, lacking the spiritual blessing she yearned for. When Henry finally stirred and accepted a cup of coffee, she gathered her courage to speak. "I know we signed the papers," Aurora said carefully, "but I believe we should honor our vows properly, with a prayer, even without witnesses." She met his eyes steadily. "God will witness." Henry's expression remained neutral, but she saw something flicker in his eyes, perhaps remembrance of another wedding, long ago. He was silent for so long that she thought he might refuse. Then he rose and crossed to a shelf, reaching behind some tools to withdraw a leather-bound Bible. The book was well worn, its pages soft with use, though Aurora suspected it hadn't been opened in years. "Was my father's," Henry said quietly, running a calloused hand over the cover. "Then mine and Mary's." He paused, then added, "Reckon it's ours now." Aurora's heart lifted at the word ours. She cleared the table while Henry leafed through the Bible, his fingers finding familiar passages. When all was ready, they stood facing each other in the morning light that streamed through the cabin's windows. Henry's voice was rough but steady as he read the traditional words. "What God hath joined together, let no man put asunder." Aurora reached out and placed her hand gently on the Bible. "Nor sorrow?" she added softly, meeting his gaze. Something shifted in Henry's expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around his eyes. They shared a simple breakfast afterward, and then each turned to their tasks for the day. Aurora found comfort in domestic work, seeing how she could bring order and warmth to the cabin. She discovered a basket of Henry's clothes that needed mending, shirts with torn sleeves, socks with holes worn through the heels. She set herself to repair them, her needle flashing in the sunlight as she worked. The days began to take on a quiet rhythm. Henry would rise before dawn to check his trap lines, returning mid-morning with whatever game he'd caught. Aurora learned to gauge his mood by the sound of his boots on the porch. A heavier tread meant poor hunting, while a lighter step usually preceded a successful catch being brought to the kitchen. She kept the cabin warm and tidy, finding satisfaction in small improvements. A thorough cleaning of the windows let in more light. Rearranging the furniture opened up the space. She hung her shawl on a peg by the door, its splash of color brightening the rough wood walls. Henry maintained a respectful distance, careful never to crowd her in the cabin's confined space. He seemed to appreciate her efforts, though he spoke little. Sometimes she would catch him watching her as she worked, a thoughtful expression on his face, but he would quickly look away if she met his eyes. One evening, about a week after their arrival, they sat by the fire after supper. The wind had picked up outside, carrying the promise of snow. Aurora had been turning something over in her mind all day and finally found the courage to speak. "I want you to know," she said carefully, keeping her eyes on her mending, "that I've made my peace with whatever future God wills for us." She took a steady breath. "Even if that means a childless one." Henry's hands tightened on his coffee mug. When she dared to look up, she saw guilt flickering in his eyes, mixed with something deeper. Grief, perhaps, or regret. He opened his mouth as if to speak, and she sensed he was close to talking about his wife's death. But the words seemed to catch in his throat, and after a moment he simply nodded and turned back to the fire. Later that night, the promised storm arrived. The wind rose to a howl, rattling the shutters and driving snow against the windows. Aurora could see how such nights might feed loneliness, filling the darkness with memories and regrets. She lit an extra lamp, its warm glow pushing back the shadows, and picked up the Bible from its shelf. Opening to the Psalms, she began to read aloud, her voice steady against the storm's fury. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." She didn't look directly at Henry, but she was aware of him settling deeper into his chair, the tension gradually leaving his shoulders as the familiar words filled the cabin. She continued reading, letting the ancient poetry speak of comfort and protection, of valleys of shadow and cups running over. When she finally closed the Bible, she found Henry had fallen asleep in his chair. His face was more peaceful than she'd yet seen it, the worry lines smoothed away. It struck her that this might be his first truly restful sleep in years. Moving quietly, Aurora banked the fire and turned down the lamps. She placed an extra blanket over Henry's sleeping form, careful not to wake him. Before retiring to bed, she paused by the window, watching the swirling snow illuminate briefly in the lamplight before vanishing into darkness. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, a different kind of weather was changing. Where there had been emptiness, something new was taking root. Not love, not yet, but perhaps understanding. Where there had been silence, words of faith had found voice again. And where there had been only memories of family, the first fragile seeds of a new one were beginning to sprout. Aurora offered a silent prayer of thanks before climbing into bed. Across the cabin, Henry's steady breathing mingled with the storm's voice, no longer quite so lonely a sound. They were building something here, slow and careful as the morning's exchange of vows. Not a passion, but a partnership. Not a replacement for what was lost, but something new, shaped by sorrow yet reaching toward hope. The lamp burned low, casting soft shadows on the cabin's walls. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but it no longer seemed to matter so much. Within these walls, a space that had known only grief for so long was learning to hold other things: peace, purpose, and the possibility of healing. The storm passed as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind a crystalline morning. Sunlight sparkled off fresh snow, and icicles dripped steadily from the cabin's eaves. Henry stood at the window, mentally calculating what supplies they needed. The winter stores were running low, especially salt for preserving meat and nails for repairs to the chicken coop he'd spotted Aurora examining yesterday. "I need to ride into town," he announced over breakfast, watching Aurora's hands pause briefly as she kneaded dough. "We're short on some necessities." She nodded, not looking up. "Be careful on the trail. The fresh snow can hide ice." Henry appreciated her practical concern. He'd noticed how she never wasted words on empty chatter, speaking only when something needed saying. It made the cabin's silence comfortable rather than strained. He saddled his horse after breakfast, the leather creaking in the cold. The morning air bit sharp and clean in his lungs as he guided his mount down the snow-packed trail. Tracks showed where deer had crossed during the night, and a fox's delicate prints wove between the trees. Henry found himself noting these signs with new purpose, thinking of how he might point them out to Aurora someday. The ride into White Rock took longer than usual with the fresh snow. By the time Henry tied his horse outside the general store, the sun had climbed high enough to start melting the icicles hanging from the walkway's roof. A group of men stood outside the barber shop, their conversation dying as Henry approached. He felt their stares but kept his eyes forward. The store's bell jangled as he entered. Elias Hart looked up from behind the counter, his welcoming smile falling away when he recognized his customer. Henry moved through the aisles methodically, gathering salt, nails, and a few other items Aurora had mentioned needing. "Didn't expect to see you back in town so soon," Elias said, as Henry set his purchases on the counter. "Thought you'd be busy with your investment." Henry met his gaze steadily. "Just need supplies." "Must be quite a burden, taking on damaged goods like that." Elias's voice dripped with false sympathy. "You can't fix what's broken in her, you know. Some things are cursed from birth." Henry's hands tightened on the counter's edge, but he kept his voice level. "I reckon what's truly broken is a man who'd mock another's misfortune." He counted out coins for his purchases. "Good day, Mr. Hart." As he stepped back onto the street, Pastor Rhodes emerged from the barber shop. The preacher's stern face registered disapproval as he moved to block Henry's path. "Mr. Cutter," he said, loud enough for others to hear, "I must speak with you about this mockery you've made of the sacred institution of marriage." Henry felt heat rise in his neck, not from shame but anger at how these men spoke of Aurora. "There's no mockery in offering shelter to one who needs it." "You purchased her like cattle at auction," the pastor pressed. "That's not God's way." "With respect, Pastor," Henry replied, "I've seen God's way in how she faces each morning with grace, despite those who tear her down." He stepped around the preacher. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a long ride home." Whispers followed him down the street. He heard fragments, "unnatural arrangement," and "living in sin and God's judgment." The words burned in his ears even as he tried to ignore them. Not for his own sake, he'd long since stopped caring what the town thought of him, but for Aurora's. She deserved better than their cruel judgments. The ride home gave him time to settle his thoughts. As the town fell away behind him, the mountain air seemed to wash away some of the bitterness their words had stirred up. Still, he knew he needed to warn Aurora. She had a right to know what they faced. When he crested the final ridge, he pulled his horse up short. Aurora was outside the cabin, using a shovel to clear snow from a patch of ground near the south wall. She'd already exposed several square feet of soil, marking what he realized must be intended as a garden plot. The sight struck him deeply, this woman planning for growth and life in the shadow of those small graves. She looked up at his approach, pushing back her bonnet. "Welcome home," she called, and the simple words warmed something in his chest. This was home now, he realized. Not just his cabin anymore, but their home. He took care of his horse before joining her by the cleared ground. "Planning a garden?" Aurora nodded, leaning on her shovel. "The soil looks good here, protected from the worst winds, and it'll get sun most of the day." She glanced at him. "If you don't mind?" "It's your home too now," he said quietly. Then, knowing he couldn't delay the warning. "Though you should know, town's not taking kindly to our arrangement." "Let me guess," she said, a hint of steel entering her voice. "Pastor Rhodes is concerned for our souls, and Elias Hart is spreading his particular brand of Christian charity?" Henry nodded, somewhat surprised by her directness. "Let them talk," she said firmly. "I answer to higher ground." She turned back to her work, then added softly, "We both do." That evening, after Aurora had gone to bed, Henry sat alone by the fire. Her words about higher ground echoed in his mind, stirring memories of his own father reading from the Bible, of Mary's quiet faith, of his son's small hands folded in prayer. Without quite meaning to, he found himself forming words he hadn't spoken in years. "Lord," he whispered, feeling strange and rusty at it. "I don't rightly know if you're listening anymore, but if you are, help me do right by her. She deserves that much." He sat for a long time after that, watching the flames dance and feeling something shift inside him, like ice breaking up on a spring river. Dawn came clear and cold. Henry rose early as usual, but this morning he found Aurora already up, dressed for outdoor work. She handed him a cup of coffee without comment, and together they walked out to the garden plot she'd started. Side by side, they began clearing more snow and turning the soil, their breath fogged in the morning air as they worked, and gradually the plot grew larger. Henry found himself matching his movements to Aurora's rhythm. Lift, turn, clear. It felt right somehow, this shared labor under the brightening sky. At one point, Aurora paused to retie her bonnet. "Thank you," she said simply. Henry looked at her questioningly. "For working beside me," she explained, "for making space for new growth." He nodded, understanding she meant more than just the garden. They turned back to their work as the sun climbed higher, casting their shadows together across the freshly turned earth. Around them, the morning was full of sound, chickadees calling, snow melting, their shovels cutting into soil. It struck Henry that for the first time in years, the dawn felt more like a beginning than an ending. They worked steadily until the plot was fully cleared. Standing back to survey their progress, Henry noticed Aurora shivering slightly in the morning chill. Without thinking, he shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up at him, startled by the gesture, then smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "We should get some breakfast," she said finally. "Then maybe we can plan what to plant here when spring comes." Henry nodded, following her back to the cabin. As she walked ahead of him, still wearing his coat, he realized something important had shifted between them. They were no longer just two wounded souls sharing space, but partners building something new. Whatever the town might say, this felt right. It felt like the higher ground Aurora had spoken of. Inside the cabin, morning light streamed through windows Aurora had cleaned until they sparkled. The room smelled of coffee and fresh bread, and Henry noticed she'd hung a small cross she'd made from twine and twigs next to his on the mantel. Their prayers might still be separate, but they were praying under the same roof now. Maybe that was a start. The weeks crawled by as winter's grip loosened reluctantly on the mountain. Each morning, Aurora stood at the cabin door, watching for signs of spring in the still frozen landscape. The snow retreated inch by inch, leaving behind muddy earth that squelched under her boots as she walked to check her garden plot. Henry found her there one gray dawn, kneeling in the cold mud despite the frost that still sparkled on the ground. Her hands were dirty as she worked, carefully placing bean seeds in neat rows. "Won't take in this soil," he said, shaking his head. "Ground's too poor up here. Nothing grows but weeds and pine trees." Aurora looked up at him, determination bright in her eyes. "Everything deserves a chance to grow," she replied, patting another seed into place, "even if folks say it can't." Henry recognized the deeper meaning in her words, but couldn't bring himself to acknowledge it. Instead, he watched as she continued planting beans, corn, and hardy root vegetables she'd traded for in town. Her movements were sure and practiced, each seed placed with purpose and accompanied by a whispered prayer. "My mama taught me about planting," she said, breaking the silence. "Said you had to put your heart into the earth along with the seeds. That's what makes them grow." She sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her skirts. "She always said there's no such thing as barren ground, just soil waiting for the right care." Henry shifted uncomfortably, hearing echoes of his own harsh words about the land. "Well, don't get your hopes up too high," he warned. "Frost comes late up here and the growing season's short." But Aurora just smiled, that gentle expression that always made him feel both seen and forgiven. "Hope's like a seed itself, Mr. Cutter. Sometimes it just needs time to sprout." Days passed, and Aurora tended her garden with faithful dedication. Each morning and evening she could be found there, pulling weeds, checking the soil, and speaking soft encouragements to the earth as if it could hear her. Henry caught himself watching her more often than he meant to, struck by how she approached each task with such gentle persistence. The weather remained stubbornly cold, with nights that threatened frost and days that barely warmed. Henry was certain the seeds would rot in the ground, but he kept his doubts to himself. Something in Aurora's quiet determination made him hold his tongue. Then one morning, 2 weeks after the planting, Aurora's cry of joy brought him running from the woodpile. He found her kneeling by the garden, tears streaming down her face as she pointed to a tiny green shoot pushing through the dark soil. "See?" she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Life can grow where it shouldn't." Henry knelt beside her, staring at the fragile stem. It seemed impossible. This delicate thing emerging from earth he'd long ago judged worthless. Yet there it was, defying his certainty with its simple presence. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, reaching out to gently touch the leaf with one rough finger. "You proved me wrong, Mrs. Cutter." Aurora's smile at his use of her married name warmed something inside him that had been cold for far too long. "Sometimes," she said, "we just need someone to believe in us before we can grow." That evening, something shifted in their quiet routine. Instead of eating their supper in customary silence, Aurora shared stories about her mother's garden back in Kansas. Her face lit up as she described the rows of corn that stretched toward the horizon, the sweet peas that climbed the fence posts, and the pumpkins that grew so large her little brothers could sit on them. Henry found himself chuckling at her tales, particularly one about a determined raccoon that kept stealing ears of corn, despite her father's increasingly elaborate attempts to stop it. The sound of his own laughter startled him. It had been so long since mirth had found its way past his grief. Aurora pulled a pan of cornbread from the oven, its golden surface cracked and steaming. "Mama's recipe," she said, setting it on the table. "Though I had to guess at some of the measurements. She always cooked by feel." The bread was perfect, crusty on the outside, tender within. Henry found himself taking a second piece, then a third, enjoying not just the food, but the comfortable companionship that had somehow grown between them. As they cleaned up after the meal, Aurora began to hum softly. The tune was unfamiliar but sweet, rising and falling like a gentle breeze through summer leaves. "What's that song?" Henry asked, surprising himself with the question. "It's called In the Garden," Aurora replied. "It was Mama's favorite hymn. She used to sing it while she worked." She hesitated, then added, "I could teach it to you, if you'd like." Henry started to refuse. He hadn't sung since Mary died, but something in Aurora's hopeful expression made him nod instead. "I ain't much for singing," he warned. "Voice as rough as bark." "The good Lord cares more for the heart behind the voice than the sound itself," Aurora assured him. She sang the first line slowly, letting the words ring clear in the cabin's quiet space. "I come to the garden alone, while the dew is still on the roses." Line by line, she taught him the hymn. Henry's voice was indeed rough, unused to shaping melody, but Aurora's gentle guidance helped him find the tune. Soon their voices blended, her clear soprano and his hesitant bass, in the simple words about walking and talking with God in a garden. As darkness fell outside, Aurora lit the lantern and, instead of placing it on the table as usual, set it in the window facing the valley below. The flame caught the glass panes, creating a warm glow that seemed to reach out into the gathering night. "Mama always said a light in the window was a beacon for travelers," she explained, adjusting the lantern's position. "It tells them there's welcome waiting if they need it." Henry thought about his own journeys through the mountains, how a distant light could mean the difference between hope and despair. "Reckon we're about as high as anyone could put a light," he observed. "Might help some poor soul find their way." "That's why we should keep it burning," Aurora said softly. "Everyone needs a light to guide them home sometimes." They stood together at the window, watching their lantern's glow reflect off the last patches of snow. From below, Henry knew, it would appear as just a tiny spark of warmth in the vast darkness of the ridge. But even a small light could make a big difference to a lost traveler. The familiar hymn tune rose in his mind again, and without thinking he began to hum it. Aurora joined in, their voices weaving together in the quiet room. The sound filled the cabin's shadows with something that felt remarkably like peace. Later that night, after Aurora had retired to her bed in the small room they'd arranged for her, Henry sat alone by the dying fire. The lantern still glowed in the window, casting its steady light into the darkness. He thought about seeds pushing through supposedly barren soil, about hymns sung by unpracticed voices, about light reaching out to guide lost souls home. "You were right, Lord," he whispered, glancing at the two crosses on the mantel, his old wooden one and Aurora's simpler version made of twigs. "Sometimes life grows where we least expect it." Outside, a spring wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of warmer days to come. In the garden, underneath the cold ground, more seeds were gathering strength to grow, proving that faith, like hope, could take root even in the most unlikely soil. The lantern's gleam reached out across the valley, a symbol of welcome and warmth in the mountain's darkness. Within its circle of light, two wounded souls were learning that God's grace, like Aurora's garden, could flourish in the most unexpected places, bringing new life to ground long thought barren. The morning dawned gray and bitter, frost crystallizing on the cabin windows. Henry pulled on his heavy coat and checked his rifle, while Aurora stirred the breakfast fire. Their morning routine had settled into comfortable silence over the past weeks, broken only by the scrape of boots on wood and the quiet clink of coffee cups. "Storm's coming," Henry said, glancing through the window at the heavy clouds gathering over the peaks. "Won't be gone long. Just need to check the trap line before the weather turns." Aurora nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter. "Take extra bread," she said, pushing a cloth-wrapped bundle toward him. "The wind's got teeth today." Henry tucked the bread into his saddlebag and stepped out into the biting air. His horse stamped impatiently in the yard, breath streaming white in the cold. The animal's coat had grown thick for winter, but even so it shivered as Henry swung into the saddle. The trail to the creek wound through stands of bare aspen and dark pine. Henry's eyes scanned the ground automatically, reading the morning's story in tracks and broken twigs. A deer had passed through before dawn. Fox prints dotted the snow near a fallen log. Everything seemed normal until he reached the first trap. He dismounted to check the steel jaws, empty but sprung. Odd. Henry frowned, noting how the snow around it was disturbed. These weren't animal tracks marking the powder. These were footprints, small, bare human feet that made his chest tighten with concern. No one should be walking barefoot in this weather. "Easy now," he murmured to his horse, leading it carefully as he followed the trail. The footprints wandered, unsteady, speaking of exhaustion and confusion. They led him away from the creek, through a thicket of scrub oak, and into a small clearing. There, collapsed beside one of his snares, lay a boy. Henry's heart jumped into his throat. The child couldn't have been more than 10 years old, thin as a winter shadow. A torn ute blanket was wrapped around his shoulders, but his feet were bare and blue with cold. Dark hair fell, across his face, crusted with ice. Moving slowly, Henry knelt beside the still form. He could see the boy's chest rising and falling. Alive, thank God. But barely. When he touched the child's shoulder, eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes dark with fever and fear. The boy tried to speak, words slurring in what Henry recognized as Ute. In his years as an army scout, he'd learned enough to recognize the language, though he couldn't speak it well. He kept his voice gentle, using the few Ute words he knew for safe and help. "Ain't gonna hurt you, son," he added in English, though he wasn't sure the boy understood. "Let's get you somewhere warm." With infinite care, Henry lifted the child. He weighed almost nothing, bird-boned and burning with fever. The boy's head lolled against Henry's chest as he carried him to the horse. For a moment, the weight in his arms brought back memories so sharp they stung, carrying his own son, Samuel, up to bed after he'd fallen asleep by the fire. He pushed the thoughts away. This child needed help now. Henry mounted carefully, cradling the boy against him with one arm while he turned the horse toward home. The animal seemed to sense the urgency, picking its way sure-footed through the growing snow. Aurora must have been watching for him. She threw open the cabin door before he'd fully reached the yard, her eyes widening at the sight of his burden. "Lord have mercy," she breathed, rushing to help as Henry dismounted. "Bring him in quick. The poor child's half frozen." They carried the boy inside, laying him gently on Aurora's bed. She moved with practiced efficiency, stoking the fire and putting water to boil while Henry removed the child's frozen clothes. "Daniel," the boy whispered when Aurora pressed a cup of warm broth to his lips. "My name, Daniel." "Rest easy, Daniel," Aurora soothed, supporting his head as he sipped. "You're safe now." Henry watched from the doorway as Aurora tended to the boy. Her hands were sure and gentle as she bathed his feet, checking for frostbite, and wrapped him in warm blankets. She sang softly as she worked, an old hymn that made the cabin feel somehow larger, less lonely. Then Daniel's feverish voice joined hers, weak but clear, matching the melody perfectly. Henry felt the world tilt beneath his feet. That song, it was the same one Samuel used to sing, the one Mary had taught him. Jesus Loves Me, the simple tune that had echoed through this cabin years ago, before the blizzard took them both. Aurora must have seen something in his face. She reached out, touching his arm gently. "Henry." He shook his head, unable to speak past the knot in his throat. The boy had drifted back to sleep, his breathing easier now, more regular. Henry stared at Daniel's face, peaceful in sleep, and felt something crack open in his chest, a door he'd thought permanently sealed. Later that night, after Daniel's fever had broken and Aurora had finally been persuaded to rest herself, Henry sat in his chair by the fire. The cabin felt different, as if the presence of the child had changed its very air. Where silence had ruled for so long, now there was the soft sound of two people breathing in sleep. The crackle of the fire, the whisper of wind under the eaves. Aurora's quiet footsteps made him turn. She stood in her doorway, wrapped in her shawl, watching him with knowing eyes. "I heard him too," she said softly. "Singing that hymn. It was your boy's song, wasn't it?" Henry nodded, his hands tightening on the arms of his chair. "Samuel loved it? Would sing it morning to night, driving Mary halfway crazy sometimes?" His voice cracked on their names. Aurora crossed the room and knelt beside his chair. In the firelight, her face was gentle with understanding. "Maybe," she said carefully. "Your home's meant to hold more than memories." Henry looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in weeks. He saw the strength in her, the deep well of love she carried despite her own losses. She'd made this cabin a home again, bringing light and warmth where there had been only shadows. "What if I fail him too?" Henry whispered, voicing his deepest fear. "Like I failed them?" "You didn't fail them, Henry," Aurora said firmly. "The storm wasn't your doing. And Daniel needs us now. Both of us. God doesn't send us challenges we're not meant to face." Through the open bedroom door, they could see Daniel sleeping peacefully, his face smoothed by rest. The sight stirred something in Henry's heart, not replacing the love he held for Samuel, but making room beside it, like a garden growing new flowers without disturbing the old. "He'll need clothes," Henry said finally, "and shoes, proper ones." Aurora's smile was like sunrise. "We'll manage," she said. "Together." Outside, the promised storm had arrived, wind moaning around the cabin corners. But inside, the fire burned warm and steady, casting its light over 3 people who had each been lost in their own way, now finding their way toward something that felt remarkably like family. Daniel slept on, safe and warm, while Henry and Aurora sat in comfortable silence by the fire. The old hymn played softly in Henry's mind, no longer a source of pain but a bridge between past and present, between what was lost and what might yet be found. In the corner, Aurora's lantern still glowed in the window, reaching out into the storm-dark night. Its light seemed stronger now, as if reflecting the growing warmth within the cabin's walls, a beacon not just for travelers, but for hope itself. The mountain spring came slowly, like a shy animal testing the air. Snow still blanketed the ground, but patches of earth began showing through where the strengthening sun touched longest. Inside Henry Cutter's cabin, warmth spread from more than just the crackling hearth. "Now fold your hands like this," Aurora demonstrated, sitting beside Daniel at the rough-hewn table. The boy copied her gesture, carefully, dark eyes intent on her movements. "That's right. Now we say thank you to God for our food." Daniel's tongue worked carefully around the English words. "Thank you, God." "Good," Aurora beamed. "And now we can eat." Henry watched from his chair by the fire, whittling a piece of pine wood with careful strokes. The boy had been with them for 5 days now, gaining strength with each passing sunrise. The fever had broken on the second night, and color had returned to his cheeks. He was still too thin, but Aurora's hearty stews were working their magic. 1, 2, 3, Aurora counted, pointing to the spoons laid out for washing. Daniel repeated after her, his accent thick but determined. She moved on to other objects around the cabin, cups, chairs, windows. The boy soaked up each new word like spring earth drinking rain. Henry's knife moved steadily over the wood in his hands, shaping what would become a small horse. He remembered carving similar toys for Samuel, the memory no longer quite so sharp with pain. The wood chips fell softly as he worked, and occasionally Daniel's eyes would drift to watch him, curious but still cautious. Later that evening, as Aurora stirred the stew pot, Daniel approached Henry's chair. He moved quietly, like a young deer, ready to bolt at any sudden movement. But his eyes were fixed on the half-finished carving in Henry's hands. "Horse?" he asked softly, using one of his new English words. Henry nodded, holding out the carving so the boy could see better. "That's right. Want to watch me finish it?" Daniel settled cross-legged on the floor beside Henry's chair, far enough away to feel safe, but close enough to see. His eyes followed every movement of the knife as Henry carefully shaped the horse's legs, then its flowing mane. Aurora's voice lifted in a gentle hymn as she worked, and soon Daniel's clear tenor joined her, matching the melody perfectly, though the English words were still beyond him. The sound filled the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. A sudden pop from a log in the hearth made Daniel jump, his shoulders tensing. Henry kept his movements slow and steady, continuing to work on the carving as if nothing had happened. After a moment, the boy's shoulders relaxed again. "There now," Henry said softly, smoothing the last touches on the wooden horse. He held it out to Daniel. "Reckon he needs someone to run him through his paces?" Daniel's eyes widened. He glanced from the horse to Henry's face and back again, as if unsure he understood. Henry nodded encouragement, and slowly the boy reached out to take the carving. "What do you say, Daniel?" Aurora prompted gently from the stove. "Thank you," Daniel whispered, cradling the wooden horse against his chest. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Henry needed to ride into town for medicine. Daniel's cough still lingered, and Aurora wanted to be sure it didn't settle in his chest. He tightened the saddle cinch as Aurora came out to see him off. "Mind how you go," she said, handing him a list written in her neat hand. "Storm's brewing up north." Henry nodded, studying her face in the early light. She looked tired but happy, her eyes bright with purpose again. Having Daniel to care for had awakened something in her that had been sleeping since the day they met. The ride into White Rock took longer than usual, the trail muddy with melting snow. By the time Henry reached the general store, the morning was well advanced. The bell above the door jangled as he entered. Tom Wheeler, the storekeeper, looked up from his ledger. His welcoming smile faded slightly when he recognized Henry. "Well now," Wheeler drawled, "if it ain't the mountain man himself. Heard you took in a stray." Henry set Aurora's list on the counter without responding. Wheeler began gathering the items, but his mouth kept running. "Folks are talking, you know. First you take up with that barren woman, now you've got yourself a red son? Ain't natural if you ask me." Henry's hands tightened on the counter edge. "Ain't asking you," he said coldly. "Just need what's on that list." Wheeler chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. Course, just making conversation. Though I reckon most men would want their own blood to carry on their name, not some half-breed orphan." Henry leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Ain't my son's color that makes him worth something. It's his heart, same as any child." He straightened up, towering over the counter, Now, you got that medicine on the list? Wheeler's smile disappeared entirely. He finished gathering the supplies in silence, his hands shaking slightly as he wrapped the bottles of medicine in paper. The ride home was tense, Henry's jaw aching from clenching it. But as he approached the cabin, the sound of laughter drifted down to meet him. He reined in his horse, listening. Through the open window, he could see Aurora seated at the table with Daniel. A Bible lay open between them, and Aurora's finger traced under the words as Daniel carefully sounded them out. "The Lord is my shepherd," Aurora supplied gently. "Shepherd," Daniel repeated. "I shall not want." Henry sat motionless in the saddle, watching. The scene before him was so different from the empty cabin he'd inhabited for so long. Now there was warmth, learning, laughter, life. He dismounted quietly, not wanting to break the moment, but Daniel's keen ears caught the sound of his boots on the path. The boy looked up, and for the first time since they'd found him, a real smile broke across his face. "Henry," he called out, using one of the English words he'd mastered early. "Come see." Inside, the cabin smelled of fresh bread and coffee. Aurora had swept the floor and hung new curtains she'd made from an old dress. Daniel's wooden horse stood proudly on the mantel beside the carved cross, as if it had always belonged there. "He's learning so quickly," Aurora said, proudly, as Henry set down his packages. "Show him, Daniel." The boy straightened in his chair and carefully counted to 10 in English, then recited the Lord's Prayer as far as "daily bread" before faltering. Aurora beamed like sunrise. That evening, as the last light faded from the sky, they sat together by the fire. Daniel played with his wooden horse on the hearth, making soft clicking sounds as it galloped across the stones. Aurora mended one of Henry's shirts, humming quietly. Henry himself sat in his usual chair, but his eyes weren't fixed on the flames as they used to be. Instead, they moved between the woman and the boy, watching them exist so naturally in the space that had held only ghosts for so long. The cabin felt alive again, not just lived in, but alive, breathing with shared breaths, warming with shared warmth, growing with shared hope. The walls that had echoed with absence now rang with Daniel's laughter, Aurora's hymns, the simple sounds of family finding its way. Aurora looked up from her sewing to find Henry watching her. Her needle paused mid-stitch. "What is it?" Henry shook his head slowly. "Just thinking about how empty this place used to be, how quiet." "And now?" she asked softly. Before Henry could answer, Daniel broke into song, the same hymn he'd sung that first night, but stronger now. Aurora joined in, her alto weaving with his clear tenor. After a moment, Henry added his own rough bass, surprising himself. The three voices filled the cabin, spilling out into the spring night where the last snow was finally beginning to melt. Like the season itself, something new was taking root here, not erasing what came before, but growing alongside it, turning winter's loss into spring's promise. Daniel's voice faltered on a verse, and Aurora reached out to squeeze his shoulder encouragingly. The boy leaned into her touch, trust replacing fear. Henry watched them, feeling his own heart crack open a little wider, making room for this new kind of family, not bound by blood but by something just as strong: love, choice, and the courage to begin again. Outside, the wind had shifted to the south, bringing warmer air up from the valleys. Spring was coming at last to the high country, and with it, the promise of new growth in soil once thought barren. Inside the cabin, 3 hearts beat in quiet harmony, each healing the others in ways that needed no words to explain. The morning sun painted golden stripes across Aurora's garden, where purple and yellow wildflowers nodded between neat rows of vegetables. She knelt in the rich soil, her hands gentle as she tended the tender shoots. 6 months ago, this plot had been frozen ground. Now it burst with life, just like the cabin behind her. A rider appeared on the trail, the horse picking its way carefully up the steep path. Aurora straightened, shading her eyes. The figure resolved into Miss Clara Dawson, the schoolteacher from White Rock, her proper riding skirt, gathering dust from the trail. "Mrs. Cutter," Clara called out, reining her horse to a stop. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I've heard so much about your garden, I had to see it for myself." Aurora wiped her hands on her apron and smiled. "No intrusion at all. Would you like some tea?" Clara dismounted gracefully, her eyes wide as she took in the thriving plot. "They said you'd worked a miracle up here, but I hardly believed it. Nothing grows this high, or so everyone claimed." "The Lord provides," Aurora said simply, leading the way to the cabin. "Sometimes we just have to be patient and trust." Inside, Daniel looked up from his reading primer, curious about their visitor. Clara's expression softened at the sight of him. "Hello there," she said gently. "You must be Daniel. I'm Miss Dawson, the schoolteacher." Daniel ducked his head shyly, but managed a quiet "hello" in careful English. While the kettle heated on the stove, Aurora showed Clara around the garden. The schoolteacher marveled at the neat rows of peas climbing their strings, the sturdy potato plants, and the riot of wildflowers Aurora had transplanted from the mountainside. "But how?" Clara asked, touching a bright columbine blossom. "The soil up here was dead," Aurora finished. "Maybe it just needed someone to believe in it." She smiled, like people sometimes. They settled on the cabin's small porch with their tea. Daniel brought out the wooden horse Henry had carved him, showing it to Clara with pride. "I've never seen anything like this," Clara said softly, watching Daniel return to his reading. "The way you've made this place bloom, not just the garden, but everything." She hesitated. "You know what they said about you in town?" Aurora's hands tightened slightly on her cup. "I know." "But look what God has done through you." Clara's eyes shone. "You've created something beautiful here, something holy." Later that afternoon, as Clara prepared to leave, she pressed Aurora's hand. "May I write about this? People should know." Aurora nodded slowly. "If you think it will help others find hope." The schoolteacher mounted her horse, then paused. "The widow Jenkins asked me to tell you. She's thinking of riding up next week. Said she could use some of your prayers." Aurora's heart warmed. "Tell her she's welcome. We'll have tea waiting." As summer deepened, more visitors found their way up the mountain trail. Mostly widows, their grief still raw, drawn by whispered stories of the barren woman who had made the wilderness bloom. Aurora listened to their stories, prayed with them, and sent them home with fresh vegetables and renewed spirits. In town, the changes didn't go unnoticed. Elias Hart stood in his store doorway, watching another wagon head toward the mountain. His face darkened as he recognized the widow Murphy at the reins. "It ain't right," he muttered to Pastor Rhodes, who was examining a barrel of apples. "That woman's getting above herself playing it, being some kind of mountain saint." The pastor straightened, frowning. "I've heard troubling things. They say she's taken in a half-breed boy, living up there without proper Christian instruction." "And that husband of hers," Elias spat. "Letting her turn his place into some kind of refuge for strays and sinners. What's next? Will they start taking in every lost soul that wanders by?" Pastor Rhodes nodded gravely. "Perhaps it's time to alert the district authorities. This situation, requires official attention. That evening, he sat at his desk, pen scratching across paper as he composed his letter. Outside his window, the sunset painted the mountains gold, reaching all the way up to where a small cabin perched, its windows gleaming like stars in the gathering dusk. Up at the cabin, Daniel stood by the small graveyard, staring at the weathered crosses. Henry found him there, the boy's small figure still against the evening sky. "They're your family?" Daniel asked quietly, not turning around. Henry moved to stand beside him, his broad shoulders bowed slightly. "Yes, my Mary and little Samuel." Daniel reached out to touch the rough carved names. "Like my mother," he said softly, "gone to the spirit world." Henry's throat tightened. He watched as Daniel bent down and placed a perfect columbine blossom on each small mound. The gesture, so simple and pure, struck Henry's heart like a bell. "Thank you, son," he managed. Daniel looked up at him then, really looked at him, trust finally replacing the wariness in his dark eyes. He slipped his small hand into Henry's large one, and together they stood in the golden evening light, two hearts finding healing in shared grief. From the cabin came the soft sound of music. Aurora had borrowed a harmonica from one of the visiting widows, and now its sweet notes drifted out across the mountain. She played an old lullaby, one her mother had sung to her, its gentle melody weaving peace through the summer air. Henry and Daniel walked back to the cabin, hand in hand. Inside, Aurora sat by the fire, the harmonica gleaming in her hands as she played. The last sunlight streamed through the windows she kept so clean, catching the dust motes like floating gold. Daniel curled up on his pallet by the hearth, his wooden horse clutched close. The music filled every corner of the cabin, every space once hollow with loss. It spilled out the windows and doors, down the mountainside where the garden grew strong and sure. It reached up to the darkening sky where the first stars were appearing, a song of family found and love restored. Henry settled into his chair, watching Aurora play. Her face was peaceful, lit from within by something stronger than happiness, a deep, abiding joy that had nothing to do with what the world said she lacked, and everything to do with what God had given. The harmonica's notes grew softer as Daniel's eyes drooped. Aurora played until his breathing evened out into sleep, then lowered the instrument to her lap. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore, but full of all the small sounds of family. Daniel's quiet breathing, the crackle of the fire, the wind in the pines outside, Henry's chair creaking as he leaned forward to stoke the flames. "That was beautiful," Henry said softly. Aurora smiled. "My mother played every evening, right up until she passed. Said music was God's way of reminding us that beauty can grow anywhere, even in the hardest places." Henry looked around the cabin, at the herbs drying from the rafters, the fresh curtains Aurora had sewn, Daniel sleeping peacefully by the hearth, his wooden horse standing guard. So much had changed since that cold winter night, when he'd laid down a silver dollar and brought home a wife. Outside, a whip-poor-will called, its lonely song transformed into something like praise as it echoed off the mountain. The stars wheeled overhead, watching over the small cabin where love had taken root in barren ground and bloomed into something wild and wonderful and new. Aurora set the harmonica aside and picked up her mending, humming softly. The peaceful domesticity of the moment wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Henry found himself humming along, his deep voice harmonizing with hers as naturally as breathing. In his sleep, Daniel smiled. The night deepened, full of promise. Whatever storms might come, whether from town gossip or official letters or the wild mountain weather itself, this small family had found something precious, a love that could weather any trial, a faith that could move mountains, and a hope that bloomed as surely as Aurora's garden in what was once frozen ground. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountain peaks when hoofbeats echoed up the trail. Aurora looked up from where she knelt in her garden, dirt still clinging to her hands. The sound was different from their usual visitors, multiple horses, moving with purpose. Henry emerged from the woodshed, axe in hand, his shoulders tensed as he watched the riders approach. 3 men on horseback appeared around the bend, their badges glinting in the early light. Daniel, who had been helping Aurora weed the bean rows, pressed close to her side. She wrapped an arm around him, feeling his small frame tremble. The lead rider, a stern-faced man with iron-gray hair, dismounted first. His movements were precise, measured, a man used to authority. The silver star on his chest caught the sunlight as he approached. "Henry Cutter?" His voice carried clearly across the yard. Henry set down his axe and stepped forward. "That's me. Sheriff Caldwell Weller." The man touched the brim of his hat. "Just appointed from Kansas Territory. These are my deputies." His politeness didn't reach his eyes, which remained as cold as Winter Creek water. Aurora stood slowly, keeping Daniel behind her. She brushed dirt from her skirt, trying to project calm she didn't feel. Something in the sheriff's stance made her heart beat faster. "What brings you up our way, Sheriff?" Henry asked, his tone carefully neutral. Weller pulled a folded paper from his vest. "Official business, I'm afraid. New federal policies being enforced across the territory. All Native children are to be properly registered and housed on reservation land under the Indian agent's supervision." The words fell like stones in the quiet mountain air. Aurora's arm tightened around Daniel. "The boy there," Weller nodded toward Daniel. "Word is he's half-Ute. No papers, no legal guardianship." He unfolded the document. "I'm here to serve notice. He'll need to be delivered to the reservation agent within 1 week's time." "No." The word burst from Aurora before she could stop it. "Sheriff, please. Daniel has no one there. His mother's dead, his uncle's gone missing. We're his family now." Weller's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, I understand your feelings, but the law's clear. These children need proper supervision, proper schooling in civilized ways." "We're teaching him," Aurora protested. "He reads now, knows his numbers. He says grace at meals and—" "That's not for me to fix," Weller cut in, his tone final. "The law says what it says. 1 week." He held out the paper to Henry. "I'll return then to escort him to the agent myself." Henry took the document, his jaw clenched tight. "And if we refuse?" The sheriff's hand rested casually near his gun belt. "Then I'd have to take him now, along with charging you both with interfering in federal matters. I don't want that kind of trouble, Mr. Cutter. Do you?" The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Henry's fingers crumpled the paper's edge. 1 week, Weller repeated. He touched his hat again, then turned and mounted up. The deputies followed suit, and soon the sound of hoofbeats faded back down the trail. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Henry's fist slammed into the porch railing with a crack that made Daniel jump. "They can't take him," he growled. "He's ours now. This is his home." Aurora hurried to him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. She could feel him trembling with rage and fear. "Then we'll pray first," she said firmly, "and fight if we must." Daniel pressed between them, his dark eyes wide with understanding. "Don't want to go," he whispered. "Please don't make me go." Henry knelt down, putting his big hands on the boy's shoulders. "Listen to me, son. You're staying right here. We'll find a way." Aurora's mind raced. "The mission school," she said suddenly. "Remember Sister Margaret who passed through last month? She said they're starting a program for native children, teaching them while letting them stay with families. If we could get word to them. Henry straightened. Might work. They'd have more standing with the federal folks than we do. He looked at the crumpled notice in his hand. I'll ride to town today. Send a letter by express post. If it reaches them before Weller comes back, I'll write it. Now. Aurora hurried inside for paper and pen. At the table, her normally steady hand shook as she wrote. Dear Sister Margaret, I pray this reaches you in time. The new sheriff means to take Daniel to the reservation in 1 week. Please help us keep our family together. The boy has flourished here. He reads, he prays, he brings such joy. Surely God didn't bring him to us only to have him torn away. With desperate hope, Aurora Bellcutter. She sanded the ink and folded the letter carefully. Henry was already saddling his horse when she brought it out. The morning had turned hot, sun beating down on the cabin's roof. I'll send it priority, he promised, tucking the envelope securely in his shirt. Maybe wire ahead to warn them it's coming. Aurora nodded. Take care in town. Weller might have men watching. Let them watch. Henry's face was grim. Got every right to send a letter. As he rode away, Aurora returned to Daniel in the garden. The boy had pulled every weed in sight, working his anxiety into the soil. She knelt beside him, showing him how to bank earth around the corn stalks. This is your home, she said softly. We won't let anyone change that. Daniel nodded, his small hands patting the dirt with careful precision. After a moment, he began humming, the hymn tune he'd known when they found him. Aurora joined in, their voices twining together in the summer air. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The day crept by with agonizing slowness. Aurora kept Daniel close, teaching him new words from Henry's Bible, helping him practice his letters. Every hoofbeat on the trail made them both tense, but it was only the usual traffic. Mrs. Jenkins coming for prayers, young Tommy Blake delivering mail. The sun was low when Henry finally returned, dust-covered and grim. Letter's gone out express, he reported. Sent a wire too, but no answer yet. He ran a hand through his hair. Town's buzzing about Weller. Seems he's already sent 3 Indian children from outlying farms to the reservation. Nobody dared stop him. Aurora's heart clenched. What are they saying about us? Mixed views. Some think we're fools to resist. Others... He managed a slight smile. Miss Clara's been telling folks how well Daniel reads now. And Widow Murphy spoke up in church about his good manners. Not everyone agrees with Weller's way of doing things. But they won't stand against him? Henry shook his head. Law's law, they say, and he's got authority to enforce it. That evening, they ate their supper in subdued quiet. Daniel kept close to them, as if afraid he'd be snatched away at any moment. When Aurora sang her usual bedtime hymn, his small voice joined in with special fervor. After he fell asleep, Henry and Aurora sat on the porch, watching stars appear above the mountains. The weight of uncertainty pressed down like a physical thing. What if the mission school doesn't answer in time? Aurora finally voiced the fear they'd both been carrying. Henry's hand found hers in the darkness. Then we'll have to decide. Submit to a law that's wrong, or defy it and face the consequences. He's our son, Aurora whispered. In every way that matters. Yes. Henry's voice was rough with emotion. God brought him to us. Don't reckon he meant for us to just give him up. A whip-poor-will called from the forest edge, its plaintive song echoing off the cabin walls. Aurora closed her eyes and prayed, not with formal words, but with the desperate pleading of a mother's heart. Somewhere down in the valley, a train whistle sounded, perhaps carrying their letter toward help. Perhaps not. The night deepened around them, full of summer sounds, crickets chirping, aspen leaves rustling, the distant howl of a coyote. Inside the cabin, Daniel slept peacefully, his wooden horse standing guard beside his bed. For now he was safe. For now he was home. But the law's shadow stretched long across their mountain sanctuary, and time was running short. They had 6 days left before Sheriff Weller returned. 6 days to find a way to keep their family whole, or face a choice between law and love that would change everything. Tomorrow they would plan, pray, and hope for word from the mission school. But tonight they simply held each other's hands and listened to the evening sounds of the home they'd built together. A home that suddenly felt as fragile as the candlelight flickering in their window. Henry guided his horse down White Rock's dusty main street, the morning sun already fierce against his neck. Church bells tolled through the crisp air, calling folks to Sunday service. He hadn't planned to attend, hadn't darkened a church door in years, but maybe the pastor would listen to reason before the sermon began. The whitewashed clapboard church stood proud against the mountain backdrop, its narrow steeple reaching skyward like an accusing finger. Henry tied his horse at the hitching post, noting how the other churchgoers gave him a wide berth. Their whispers followed him up the wooden steps. Inside, the pine pews gleamed with fresh polish, and morning light filtered through colored glass windows. Pastor Rhodes stood at the pulpit, arranging his Bible and notes. He looked up as Henry's boots echoed on the floorboards. "Brother Cutter," the pastor said, surprise evident in his tone. "What brings you to God's house this morning?" Henry removed his hat, crushing the brim between calloused hands. "Need to speak with you about Daniel, about what's right in God's eyes." The pastor's face hardened. "The law is clear, Henry. Those children belong with their own kind." "Their own kind?" Henry's voice rose. "He's a child of God, same as any other. You've seen how he's thrived with us, how he loves the Bible stories Aurora teaches him." "Scripture tells us to honor the law of the land," Pastor Rhodes replied, straightening his collar. Romans 13, verse 1. "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God." "And what of mercy?" Henry demanded. "What of suffer the little children to come unto me?" More people filed into the church, settling into pews with curious glances. The pastor's expression grew stern. "I'll not debate Scripture with you, Henry. The law exists for good reason. These native children need proper guidance on the reservation." "Proper guidance?" Henry's laugh was bitter. "Like Aurora gives him? Like the prayers and hymns he loves?" "Please lower your voice," the pastor warned. "Service is about to begin." "No." Henry's word cracked like a gunshot in the quiet church. "I came hoping to find God's mercy here. Instead, I find men hiding behind verses to avoid doing what's right." He turned on his heel, ignoring the pastor's sharp intake of breath. As he strode down the aisle, the congregation drew back. Only the widows met his eyes with sympathy. Mrs. Murphy, who'd praised Daniel's manners, Miss Clara, who'd marveled at his reading progress. But their faces showed fear, too, fear of speaking against authority. Henry burst out into the sunlight, jamming his hat back on his head. Behind him, the pastor's voice rose. "Let us pray for those who let pride blind them to God's ordained order." The words followed Henry as he mounted up and spurred his horse homeward. Anger burned in his chest, hot as trail dust. He'd hoped to find an ally in the church, but the pastor was just another man choosing the easy path over the right one. Back at the cabin, Aurora and Daniel worked together at the cook stove. The boy stood on a wooden crate, carefully stirring a pot of beans, while Aurora kneaded bread dough. The domestic scene eased some of Henry's fury, but the dread remained. "How'd it go?" Aurora asked, though his expression told her plenty. "Pastor quotes Romans about obeying authority." Henry hung his hat by the door. "Won't lift a finger to help?" Daniel looked up, worry creasing his young face. "Do I have to go away?" "No, son." Henry's voice was firm. "We're still fighting for you." Days crept past like molasses in winter. Aurora kept the cabin spotless, as if cleanliness could ward off trouble. She taught Daniel new hymns and Bible verses, treasuring each moment. Henry rode out at dawn and returned at dusk, checking the trail for any sign of lawmen. The waiting wore on them all. Daniel's nightmares returned. He'd wake crying about men on horses taking him away. Aurora would hold him, singing softly until he slept again. Henry took to sleeping in his chair by the door, rifle across his knees. On the fourth day, they heard hoofbeats. Henry had his gun in hand before he recognized young Tommy Blake on his pony. The boy carried a letter from the mission school. Aurora's hands trembled as she broke the seal. Her face fell as she read, "Dear Mrs. Cutter, while we sympathize with your situation, we cannot interfere with federal Indian policy at this time. The school's authority extends only to children already properly placed through official channels. We will pray for a peaceful resolution. Yours in Christ, Sister Margaret." Aurora crushed the letter in her fist. So even they bow to men's laws over God's mercy. That evening, after Daniel was asleep, she brought out her wedding dress from its trunk. The white fabric glowed in the lamplight as she spread it on the table. "What are you planning?" Henry asked, watching her thread a needle. "If men won't fight for mercy, I will." Aurora's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "I mean to face Sheriff Weller myself, dressed as a proper Christian woman. Let him look me in the eye and tell me why his law matters more than a child's heart." She worked through the night, taking in the dress that had grown loose in their lean mountain life. Her stitches were small and precise, each one a prayer for courage. Henry watched her, remembering how she'd stood straight-backed at that winter auction, dignity intact despite cruel whispers. "You truly mean to confront him?" he asked, as dawn began to pale the windows. "I do." Aurora tied off her last stitch. "God didn't give me a mother's heart just because I can bear children. He gave it to me for times like this, when a child needs protecting." She held up the dress, now altered to fit perfectly. In the early light, it seemed to glow with its own fierce radiance, like aurora lights in the winter sky. Her face showed the same quiet fire that had first caught Henry's attention that snowy night at the auction. "Sheriff Weller will be back in 2 days," she said, smoothing the fabric. "I aim to meet him with truth and scripture both. If he means to take our boy, he'll have to face a mother's prayer first." Henry touched the dress's sleeve, feeling the strength in those delicate stitches. "You're sure about this?" "As sure as I am that God sent Daniel to us." Aurora carefully hung the dress by the window. "We've prayed for help, and none has come. Sometimes the Lord expects us to be His hands in the world." Outside, the mountain wind stirred aspen leaves, their whispers like countless amens. Inside, Daniel slept peacefully, his wooden horse standing guard. Aurora's wedding dress caught the first sunlight, transformed now from a symbol of past pain into armor for the battle ahead. 2 days remained until Sheriff Weller's return. 2 days to prepare for a stand that would test not just their courage, but their faith that love could triumph over law. Aurora's resolve shone in her eyes as she watched the sunrise paint the mountains gold. If men wouldn't fight for mercy, then this barren woman would show them what a mother's heart could do. The first rays of sunlight had barely kissed the mountain peaks when hoofbeats echoed through the valley. Henry stood on the porch, deliberately empty-handed, watching 3 riders approach through the morning mist. Sheriff Weller led the way, flanked by 2 deputies whose hands rested too close to their holsters. Aurora emerged from the cabin, transformed in her freshly altered wedding dress. The white fabric gleamed like new snow against the weathered logs. She held her family Bible close to her heart, her steps measured and sure as she descended the porch steps. "You can take me before you take him," she declared, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. The deputies shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, but Sheriff Weller's face hardened into a sneer. "This is the law, ma'am," he said flatly. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Aurora lifted her chin. "So was stoning once," she replied, her words sharp as winter frost, until Mercy spoke louder. Movement caught Henry's eye as people began gathering at the edge of their clearing. Miss Clara Dawson stood straight-backed beside her horse. Old Farmer Jenkins leaned on his walking stick, while 3 of the town widows huddled together, shawls pulled tight against the morning chill. The sheriff surveyed the growing crowd, his jaw working. Finally, he wheeled his horse around. "You have until sundown to surrender the boy," he announced. "After that, we return with more men." The riders departed in a cloud of dust, leaving behind a heavy silence. Henry and Aurora exchanged glances before sinking to their knees in the yard. Daniel rushed from where he'd been watching through the window, clinging to Aurora's white skirts as they bowed their heads in prayer. Thunder rolled in the distance as the sun began its slow descent behind the mountains. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and threatening, as if heaven itself was holding its breath for what would come with nightfall. Dawn brought no comfort to the mountain. Dark clouds rolled across the peaks like smoke from a wildfire, matching the storm brewing in Henry's heart. He moved quietly through the dim cabin, gathering his gear while Aurora and Daniel slept. The leather creaked softly as he lifted his saddle. Outside, he worked quickly, cinching the straps with practiced hands. If he could reach town before sunrise, maybe he could trade himself for Daniel's freedom. One life for another seemed fair enough. "Stop!" Aurora's voice cut through the gray morning. She stood in the doorway, still in her nightdress, but her eyes blazed with determination. "If you surrender, they'll still take him. The law won't change just because you give up." Before Henry could argue, she disappeared inside. Minutes later, she emerged wearing her wedding dress, mounting her horse with fierce grace. Without a word, she turned toward town, leaving Henry staring after her. The church bell was ringing when Aurora reached White Rock. She dismounted, straightened her white skirts, and pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The congregation's hymn died in their throats as she marched down the aisle, her boots echoing on the floorboards. "God made me barren, not useless." Her voice filled the stunned silence. "If I can't bear life, I'll raise it." Her words trembled but held firm, like a branch bearing winter's weight. "The Lord gives different gifts to different souls. Mine is to nurture what others cast aside." Thunder rolled outside as Henry arrived, holding his hat in weather-worn hands. The first fat drops of rain began to fall as people emerged from the church, drawn by Aurora's words and the growing commotion in the square. They gathered in a widening circle, faces turned up to the weeping sky, as if waiting for an answer from above. Miss Clara Dawson stepped forward first, then Farmer Jenkins, followed by the widows. The quiet ones who had watched and waited now found their feet moving toward Aurora and Henry. The tense silence was broken by a soft sob. Eliza Weller, the sheriff's wife, stepped through the crowd, her face streaked with tears. She pressed one hand to her rounded belly, visible even beneath her Sunday dress. "You all need to hear this," she said, her voice quavering but clear. "Last winter, when the fever nearly took me, Aurora Bell came to my bedside. She prayed over me for 3 days, never leaving, even when others feared catching the sickness. Eliza's eyes found Aurora's. And now, after 10 barren years, I carry new life. Gasps rippled through the gathering. The rain fell steadier now, drumming on the church roof and running in rivulets down weather-worn faces. Pastor Rhodes bowed his head, and those closest could see tears mixing with the raindrops on his cheeks. Sheriff Weller stood frozen, his gun hand trembling at his side. The weight of the moment, his wife's testimony, the watching town, the simple truth of mercy, seemed to press down on his shoulders. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his weapon. "Go on then," he muttered, voice rough with emotion. "Raise the boy." Henry didn't wait for another word. He crossed the muddy square in 3 long strides and wrapped Daniel in his arms. The boy buried his face in Henry's chest as thunder cracked overhead, sharp as a rifle shot. Then, soft at first but growing stronger, came the sound of singing. Daniel's hymn, the one he had hummed in his fever, the one Samuel had loved, rose from the gathered townspeople. Aurora's voice joined in, steady and bright through the rain, lifting toward the stormy heavens like a prayer of thanksgiving. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." The old words echoed off the mountain, carried by dozens of voices now united in witness to love's victory over law, mercy's triumph over judgment. The July sun warmed the mountain air as wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze. Aurora's garden, once just a hopeful patch of frozen earth, now burst with color. Purple lupin, golden blanket flower, and bright red Indian paintbrush dotted the beds between neat rows of vegetables. Outside the white-painted church, townsfolk gathered in their Sunday best. Pastor Rhodes stood before the weathered wooden steps, his stern face softened by a gentle smile. Henry and Aurora approached hand in hand, their steps sure and matched. Between them walked Daniel, proudly carrying a small wooden cross that Henry had carved from mountain pine. The boy's new boots gleamed with polish, and his dark eyes sparkled with joy. Sheriff Weller and Eliza sat quietly in the front row, their tiny daughter sleeping peacefully in a blanket-lined basket. The newborn's presence felt like living proof of prayer's power, a reminder that miracles could bloom in the most unexpected places. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Rhodes began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "we gather to witness the renewal of sacred vows between Henry and Aurora Cutter, and to bless their family born of God's grace." Aurora wore her wedding dress, now adorned with tiny flowers Daniel had helped her gather. Henry stood tall in his best coat, all traces of his former isolation gone from his face. When they spoke their vows again, their voices rang clear and true. After the ceremony, tables groaned with shared bounty, fresh bread, springberry pies, and roasted venison. Laughter and conversation flowed as freely as coffee from Miss Clara's big copper pot. Children played tag between the adults' legs, while older folks swapped stories in the shade. Aurora stood near the garden she'd planted, watching it all with grateful tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "for children born of mercy, not flesh." She felt Henry's strong arm slip around her shoulders, steady and sure as the mountains themselves. "Guess that dollar went farther than I figured," he said softly, the hint of a smile in his voice. Aurora leaned into his embrace, watching Daniel share his pie with the sheriff's little girl. "Far as heaven's grace, Henry," she replied. In the deepening dusk, the church windows glowed with lamplight, beckoning like the cabin's lantern that had guided so many travelers home. Golden aspen leaves danced on the autumn breeze as evening settled over the mountain ridge. Inside the snug cabin, Lamplight cast warm shadows across weathered floorboards, while Daniel sat at the table, his tongue caught between his teeth, as he carefully formed letters in his primer. "That's right," Aurora encouraged, pausing in her bread kneading to watch him write. The yeasty smell of rising dough filled the kitchen, mingling with wood smoke from the hearth. "Your M's are getting much straighter." From above came the steady rhythm of Henry's hammer as he worked on the barn roof, preparing it for winter storms. The sound matched the comfortable beating of Aurora's heart as she shaped the dough with practiced hands. Through the window, she could see the first stars appearing in the deepening blue sky. When Henry came in for supper, his boots dusty and his shirt spotted with pine sap, they joined hands around the table. Daniel's prayer was growing more confident each day, his English and faith both flourishing in the warmth of their home. "Lord," he said clearly, "thank you for the food, and for Mama Aurora's bread, and for Papa Henry fixing the roof." He paused, then added hopefully, "And maybe for more children to come stay with us soon?" Aurora squeezed Henry's hand, remembering their own prayers for the lonely little ones they knew would find their way up the mountain path. The cabin that had once echoed with emptiness now hummed with life and possibility. After the plates were cleared, they settled by the fire. Daniel climbed into Henry's lap, his small frame fitting perfectly against the big man's chest. Aurora began to hum the old hymn that had first bound their hearts together, its melody as familiar now as breathing. The mountain wind sighed through the pines outside, but inside all was peace. Daniel's eyes grew heavy as Henry's calloused hand smoothed his hair. Through the window, their lantern cast its steady beam across the pass, a beacon for any weary traveler seeking shelter in the darkness. Henry watched his sleeping son's face, touched by firelight. "Seems he gave us a family after all," he murmured, voice rough with gratitude. Aurora's fingers never stopped their mending as she smiled. And a home where faith took root. The truth of it filled her heart, near to bursting, this place of second chances where love grew stronger than blood. The first snow began to fall outside, soft flakes dancing in the lantern light. They let Daniel sleep there in the warmth of their circle, the lamp burning steady through the gathering night, its glow a promise of welcome in the high country dark. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.